Hey everyone, for those of you who haven't been here before, my name is Derek Royden. I write a weekly story, usually every week, for a website called nationofchange.org, a great American website focused on progressive issues, so I highly encourage you to check it out, nationofchange.org. So also, along with that, I do a vlog every week, usually every week once again. This week I'm going to be looking at two different stories. I think I'm titling this one Unforeseen Consequences. That might change afterwards if I come up with something better. But basically we're going to be talking about two things having to do with climate change that, unless you really look at them, you would never discover. So the first concerns grizzly bears. And interesting changes in their behavior, which are at least partially due, it's believed, partially due to climate change. And the second is, perhaps more important for humans, the fact that plants, due to increased levels of CO2, there's a particular study we're looking at about rice, but plants in general are becoming less nutritious as a direct result of the way we live. So we should be talking about these types of things. So to begin, the first story, which is kind of a simple one, is called The Grizzly's Day in Court. I'm not going to get too into the details. She's talking about they're trying to ban a grizzly kind of trophy hunting of grizzlies in Yellowstone National Park in the United States, or continue the ban on it, I should say. Apparently there's a planned hunt sometime in the late fall, but it is being fought in court. But what I wanted to get to was just one kind of issue that she hits on that is related to the story we are doing today. So basically it became obvious years ago that white bark pine was collapsing, and these trees, as Louisa Wilcox writes, whose fatty seeds were, and in places still are, a staple for Yellowstone's grizzlies, especially females packing on pounds during late summer and fall in order to sustain themselves and newborn cubs through the following winter and spring. Anyone with open eyes could see a massive sea of red along the ridge tops, needles of trees dying from swarms of tiny mountain pine beetles. What cause? Warming winter temperatures, which had allowed beetles to survive at higher altitudes than ever before. The problem is that the white bark pine did not evolve with beetles, and without defenses, these trees are basically sitting ducks. So how does this affect bears? Well, this is one of the four main foods in this area that grizzly bears would eat. Wilcox goes on to write a little bit further down, as a factual matter, much has changed. What happened when the bears began to lose access to the seeds of the white bark pine, they had to change their diet, and so they switched primarily to meat, which of course brings them into conflict with humans as they go out and they predate on cows and scavenge elk meat left by big game hunters. So even though the Yellowstone ecosystem supports over 400,000 cows, more than all the elk, bison, and deer combined, most ranchers do not have problems with grizzlies. But a few do, especially an affluent handful who graze lands on national forests in the upper Green River area of Wyoming. And as fate would have it, some of them have a hotline to Wyoming's equally affluent governor. Instead of pursuing proven measures to avoid conflicts, these ranchers have found it easier to pick up the phone than a can of bear spray. They were, of course, represented in the courtroom by lawyers who pled their case as poor, hard-working cowfolk. Grizzlies have also been increasingly gobbling up elk piles left by big game hunters, learning that the sound of a gunshot can be a dinner bell, and I found that really interesting, that bears have basically learned that something's being taken down when they hear a gunshot. Bears are mixing it up with hunters in contests that grizzlies typically lose. In contrast to 10 plus years ago, when the leading cause of bear deaths was related to garbage, now cattle and hunter-related conflicts are the greatest killers of grizzlies. Because more bears are scrambling to make up for the loss of white bark seeds, often closer to people, we're seeing more conflicts and an unprecedented spike in grizzly bear deaths. This trend shows no sign of abating. Indeed, Wyoming plans to further shrink the population. With record levels of mortality since 2015, scientists fear that the population may be at a tipping point, just as trophy hunters are taking aim at grizzlies. So, we see from this is a direct result of climate change. Climate change is causing these bears to come more and more into contact with people, which is basically leading to, of course, many more dead grizzly bears. This aside from the fact that now hunters, well, actually all along, hunters wish to hunt these bears, not for food, not for any specific purpose, but basically so that they can put their head on a wall or turn them into a rug. So this is an unforeseen consequence of climate change, at least to some degree. Warmer temperatures allow these pine beetles to go up past where they used to be able to live, and it destroys a native species that has no defense for it. So on to the next story. This one was in Scientific American. The last one was on Counterpunch, if I forgot to mention that. This one was on Scientific American. It's a few months old, but I had heard about it, and I thought about it a little bit over time, but I finally kind of remembered recently. So this story, I think, is from the end of May, but it's basically about a study they did in China of on rice, which they placed kind of in a high CO2 environment, a little bit higher than what's normal now, but what they expect the level of CO2 to be, say, near the end of this century, and they found that it greatly reduced the number of nutrients in the rice. So the author, who's Chelsea Harvey, begins, one of the world's most important food crops may be declining in quality due to greenhouse gas emissions. The results of a major study published yesterday in Science Advances suggest that rice, a crucial food source for billions of people, is less nutritious when grown under higher carbon dioxide concentrations. Its stores of protein, iron, zinc, and some important B vitamins all decline. So, that's a potential concern for public health, the authors say, particularly in poorer nations where rice makes up a large proportion of people's diet. So actually what I wanted to mention before is I have put a link to the actual study in Science Advances below. I decided not to read from it because it's a little bit technical, but it is actually really interesting and is worth reading. So hopefully I'll remember some of the stuff that was in it and be able to add to this. These results indicate that the role of rising CO2 in reducing rice quality may represent a fundamental but underappreciated human health effect associated with anthropogenic climate change. The authors, led by Chuwu Zhu of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, wrote in the paper. The findings challenge a common argument floated among doubters of accepted climate science, that rising CO2 concentrations are a net positive for global vegetation, including crops. Representative Lamar Smith, a Texas Republican who leads the Health Science, Space and Technology Committee, is one outspoken proponent of the idea. In an essay published last summer in the Daily Signal, he argued that more carbon dioxide will lead to increased plant growth, spurring a greater volume of food production and better quality food. And this is, of course, something that the right often does, is they'll kind of find some kind of loophole in an issue, like especially as it relates to climate change. So they'll say like that basically that climate change is a good thing because it's going to allow plants to grow faster and create a more abundance of plants. The unfortunate fact is that this is actually just due to the effects of climate change itself, like rising sea levels, changing temperatures will make various areas more arid so that what would have grown there will not grow there anymore. So this is like, even just from the get-go, nonsense. But Chelsea Harvey makes it even more clear that even just on the basis of this study, this idea is disproven. The new research and other studies published before it discredit those claims. We have some rice varieties that show a stronger response to CO2 and are able to convert more of that CO2 into seed, which can be good, said senior study author Louis Ziska, a scientist with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. On the other side of that coin is the quality of that seed also being diminished in response to the CO2. The new study evaluated 18 types of commonly grown rice to see how they would respond to elevated levels of carbon dioxide. In the experiments, the researchers increased ambient carbon dioxide levels to concentrations between 568 and 590 parts per million. Currently, atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations are around 410 ppm, parts per million. But at the rate they're currently rising, they could reach the high levels used in the study by the end of the century if action isn't taken to curb them. Compared with current concentrations, the rice crop's nutrient contents all suffered under higher carbon dioxide levels. On average, protein levels declined by about 10%, iron by 8%, and zinc by 5%. The researchers also found that certain B vitamins declined significantly, some by up to 30%. Vitamin E was the only nutrient found to increase under higher CO2, which is interesting just in and of itself. But, so basically, in the future, about 25% of the Earth right now basically relies on rice as a main staple of their diet. Some places as much as, I think one of them was Bangladesh, as much as 75% of their nutrients that they get come from rice. So this is going to have a disastrous effect on people in the future. I know it's hard, like, in the society that we live in, to think ahead, and to think about the future when we probably most of us won't be here. But this is really important that we act on this now. And this is going to require not only individual changes, but political changes that, you know, I try to be optimistic, but I just don't see any kind of... in fact, I see things getting worse. I mean, obviously there's Donald Trump who takes it to a whole new level in terms of shredding regulations and allowing, you know, for more pollution, trying to revive the coal industry. But even people like, you know, who talk a good game, like Justin Trudeau here in Canada or Emmanuel Macron in France, they're really not doing much. And I do fear that the consequences, we just don't even know what can happen. We didn't expect that bears would start eating more meat because pine needles would be able to go up the top of a hill to feast on trees that have no natural defenses for them. We didn't expect that polluting the air, and not just through you know, emissions, but also through animal agriculture, would result in plants that are unbalanced in terms of taking nutrients from the soil and carbon dioxide, and then become less nutritious for people and also the animals that eat them. So these are just things we need to think about. I don't want to, you know, depress anyone, but I do think, you know, this has to be taken a little bit seriously. So on that kind of unhopeful note, I'm going to say have a great day. Try to think about these things. Try to think about how it could impact your own life, the life of your grandchildren or great-grandchildren. And always remember,